what you do, where you come from, and anything about yourself that you'd like to know. So let's start off with Ken.
Yeah, so I'm Ken Anderson. I'm the Chief Developer Advocate for Hedera Hashgraph. My background is in software architecture. I have owned an engineering firm with a bunch of really smart people solving really hard things in the integration space, and worked in telecommunications for years, and then found myself in the distributed ledger space when a client of my engineering firm decided they wanted to build something distributed. And I was like, what is this Ethereum thing? And so I got into the space, but the requirements were a little intense for Ethereum, even at the time. And so I went out looking for other DLTs that would meet the requirements and bumped into Hashgraph Algorithm, got involved with them, and then was employee probably number 7 or 9, somewhere in there, of Hedera Hashgraph when the company started officially.
Cool. Galen, next. Yeah.
I'm Galen. I am the CEO of Tlon, which is one of still probably the primary developer of Urbit. So Urbit is an identity system and an overlay operating system designed to be, think of it like a personal computer for the cloud. So one place that you can log into to manage all of your data, all of your applications, ideally to give you like a unified interface for you to communicate and collaborate with people. I've been working on Urbit since 2014, which is a hilariously long time, to also not have a super succinct way to give you the complete overview of what Urbit is, but I encourage you to go check it out. Urbit very much works and is a real thing that you can play with and experiment with, and sort of join the active community and just generally check out. I have a design background, but I grew up around a lot of technology people building software and stuff like that. So I've sort of like I guess my perspective on all this stuff is, I don't know, from the perspective of like, how do we build good human systems in general? And we happen to be thinking about software systems and you know, I don't know, not building cars or railroads or airplanes or whatever. For me, the main thing is just to build things that are, you know, make an impact on the way that people organize and live their lives.
Great. And last but not least, Brantly, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Brantley Milligan. I'm Director of Operations for a little nonprofit organization called True Names Limited, which manages and develops, maintains the open source project Ethereum Name Service, which is the leading blockchain-based naming project. I've been in the blockchain space for a long time. Probably, well, one thing I did was this website called flipping.watch back in 2017 when Ethereum actually got kind of close to flipping Bitcoin in market capitalization, although it didn't happen. It ended up becoming a floppening. So that was something. I've made some really cool memes on Reddit related to Ethereum and crypto trading. That's probably what I'm most proud of. But yeah, I'm here.
Sweet. Okay, so let's get into the questions for tonight. So the early internet was developed by the United States government to sort of survive a nuclear attack so that the computer systems were decentralized enough so that they could keep running. But that's not where it stayed. It eventually made its way into a consumer setting where normal people started using it. Let's say this is in the sort of late 80s, early 90s-ish period. I mean, there's probably some argument about where. But what were people thinking the internet could be at this time? And as a follow-up question to that, what was your first experience with the internet? So Ken, let's start with you again. Sure.
Well, I don't think that I had really what you would say a normal experience or a common experience for early internet. I remember being in high school and being so infatuated with bulletin board systems, which was kind of that pre-graphical user interface internet phase. And I remember exchanging documents, playing games, chatting, or I shouldn't say chatting, it was more like forums. And then when AOL came around, obviously I played a lot of the games that came out at that time and kind of lived in that walled garden until I discovered Netscape Navigator and then started to explore outside of that. And I can't say I know what people thought it would be, what it would become. I think we were all just so amazed at what it was. it was a place where I finally had a public stage and I could start to share ideas globally and engage with people on a global level. And at that time, it was slow enough that I don't know that anybody really imagined that we would have what we have today. Like having this conference in general was probably outside the scope of what people expected. But I also was a Star Trek fan, so there was kind of this in the back of the mind, maybe in 300 years we'll have tricorders and holding computers in our hands type thing. But that happened a lot quicker than I think most people expected. But I remember it very strongly being a place to connect and kind of express myself and also to build businesses. You know, in my young entrepreneurial days, it was a place to basically have an online brochure I could point people to. So I remember it being a business opportunity and a way to connect with people early on, and I kind of expected that to be just improving that experience and slowly getting faster and faster. At the rate things were improving at that time, I never would have expected it to get to Starlink today, for example.
Yeah, Brantly, what do you think?
Yeah, so in terms of the kind of history of the internet, I think of two main things. One is that public-private key cryptography is one of the most important inventions of the last 100 years, okay? It was only invented or discovered, however you want to think about it, in the 1970s. It's an incredible story, look it up. We kind of take it for granted today, how spectacular of an achievement that is. If you don't know what public-private key cryptography is, it's look it up, because like everything runs on it nowadays. A lot of people don't know though is that it was considered so powerful, the US government classified it as like a weapons munition or something like this. And so it was illegal if you're an American to share information with somebody who was not an American about public-private key cryptography, which basically meant that you couldn't put it in any product, you put it in the internet or anything like this. And so that was true up until like the early to mid 90s. When that ended up being changed, there was a group of people, the whole story, Hal Finney, others, who got the US government to change that. Now, that means that all the internet protocols prior to that did not have public-private key cryptography built into them. So like the web, DNS, TCP/IP, I mean, I don't know, any protocol designed prior to could not do it. It would have been illegal. Okay, so since then, we've implemented public-private key cryptography on the web, and some of these things we've tried to, but it's not evenly implemented. So there's something in my world, the naming world, DNS has something called DNSSEC, which is an attempt to add this to DNS. Is that since the 90s has existed, but it's like not used everywhere because, well, it wasn't the default, it wasn't built into it. So I think we have an opportunity in the crypto space or just in building a new internet in general to get this stuff built in from the ground floor, and we need to be setting precedents correctly. That's the first thought. Two is that, as Ken said, I don't think people fully understood how what they were building back in the 80s and 90s would grow and evolve to today, and how quickly, and also that it would be used in ways they didn't intend. I mean, this always happens with any technology, right? As a result, certain decisions people made were maybe optimized for some use cases, but not how they were used. And so it's like, well, if we could go back and change how it was created, maybe we would, but now we're kind of stuck with it because of network effects. Nothing too is I think people might have taken more time. So for example, like famously JavaScript was created in like 11 days by one person, and now the whole world runs on it. It's like, oh man, we're kind of stuck with weird idiosyncrasies of JavaScript. So my second thought was, if we're going to build a new internet, you know, one thing I would say is think in like 100 years or more for the protocols that we're building, because it has that kind of potential.
Cool. And Galen?
Yeah, I agree with that last sentiment, certainly. Let's see. So I think that thinking back, like just to my own literal experience of the early internet, which is somewhat limited. Like I remember BBS as a very, very young kid, but mostly more, yeah, like early web browser, early internet, you know, kind of like mid 90s time. It felt very chaotic. And I think that's basically because the internet, when we say the internet, we, sort of like technically, right, it's just this protocol suite. And in the 90s, it felt like a protocol suite. It was just like the ability to connect from one thing to another. It's just this extremely raw, sort of technically focused thing. The like user experience of the internet, I feel like just didn't really exist. And that's what both made it really fun and exciting. And also, I think it became like a jumping off point for people's imagination in ways that was sort of ridiculous. It's really fun to go back and look at like the advertising for internet companies and internet products from that time period, because the internet was the information superhighway that was going to like teleport you into this incredible, sort of Star Trek future, which of course we sort of live in now. Case in point being this actual event, but we also obviously don't in other ways, which I think is. And most of the, sort of weirdness that we experience with most connected technology now is because we've taken what was effectively just raw technical, protocols that were, quickly implemented and were, I think of them as like very industrial, basically, or industrial grade, and not considered as far as like how people might use them. And we've just scaled them up as rapidly as possible. And maybe because they were like, when I think of my own like feeling of using the internet, it's like these things are just so exciting that you want to, see how big they can get and see what you can do with them. And I think we're still on a long term, on a 50, 100, many hundreds of years time scale, we're still in this phase of like fascination with what it can mean to connect people who are in different locations, basically. And there's obviously something really powerful and important about that. But obviously, my perspective is that like, and especially now, maybe like after having worked on this stuff for a long time and thought about it for a long time, it's good to take a step back from it just as raw technology and consider like, okay, well, what is the impact of this stuff on our lives, and how do we actually want to use it? It's weird to reflect back on like what the internet was, honestly. I'm like, the internet was a very weird thing that it's strange that it happened so quickly, honestly.
And even the word internet is quite synonymous with we mostly know what that thing is now, but back then, even in the early 90s, there was no one word that described the internet. I mean, we had the word, but we used other words like the information superhighway, the World Wide Web, some of these other names. What do these early names say about what the expectation was for this thing and what it was good for? Just open.
I honestly don't think that people knew what it was good for. Like, I think that a lot of that was just partially like it was almost like managed by a marketing department or something like that. It was like people trying to figure out how you could capture the zeitgeist with, like with a vision of the future that was actually like not deeply considered. So one of the things that I find really fun to look at is to look at, well, everyone should go watch General Magic. But then there are a bunch of sort of similar things. So if you haven't seen General Magic, you should go and watch that. Sort of General Magic tried to create an iPhone, before the iPhone was sort of like possible to build. And they were captivated by the sort of dream of what was possible with, connected technology in your pocket, and very much lived in a very 90s dream of the future that was not possible to materialize. But what's important about General Magic is just to remember how many companies there were that believed in this kind of like this sci-fi future that was going to get delivered by the internet, but they were totally out of touch with like what the technology actually was and how mature that it was. And so it's interesting, I guess, in as much as like the internet, just as TCP/IP, the ability to connect different computers, immediately is like captures people's imagination in this very, it's like an accelerant somehow. Like just the sheer ability to do that makes you imagine that you can do all of these other things. And you go look at all the companies from the 90s and it's like half that stuff is totally impossible. Like, why were we even thinking about it? But anyway, I should also chime in.
Yeah, and I think, Kenny, you mentioned, what do these names tell us about the expectation of it? World Wide Web. Thinking of it as a web, which is full of nodes and vectors, or edges and vectors, these connected nodes throughout the world that are all connected in a web shape, and the idea that you can share information across them. So you have the information superhighway, the interconnected network, or the internet, where we have this big network of computers that are all interconnected. And I think everybody saw it and said, cool, we've got this great infrastructure for sharing information in a very distributed way. If you think about a web, there's not just one route to get from one node to the other. There's lots of routes you can take. And as a matter of fact, most people didn't realize how complex routing planes are on the network layer. But yeah, I mean, it was almost like there was a guarantee your information would get from San Francisco to New York, and it really didn't matter how it got there. There were so many connected nodes. So I think they had this infrastructure, and kind of to Galen's point, you know, they were trying to the companies that were trying to capitalize on this were trying to capture that zeitgeist. And we kind of talked about this in the green room amongst the panelists a bit. You know, it was AOL and CompuServe and Earthlink and these companies that tried to give you software to log on to the internet, and then they bundled everything. They kind of created like this walled garden of, this is how you're going to consume. These are the things we think that you're going to want to connect about. It's going to be travel agencies. It's going to be doing your taxes. It's going to be forums and chat rooms for specific types of topics. And a lot of people use that. And they even, you know, we were saying that AOL and the very first MMORPG being Neverwinter Nights was on AOL. So it was like this MMORPG back in '93. And that's what we thought it was. And then every single one of us on the panel had the experience of discovering, minimizing AOL and loading Netscape Navigator. And now all of a sudden we were outside the walled garden. And it was kind of like the Wild West. It was like, who knows what could be out there? And I think that's that transition. We had kind of like this initial marketing effort to get everybody on board and to get everybody connected to consume things that AOL and CompuServe and Earthlink wanted to sell us. And then people just started to figure their way outside of it. And it kind of evolved from there into a whole bunch of things. And I think we see this a lot in the distributed ledger space as well. I mean, who would have thought we would be having, you know, the entire DeFi movement right now? I mean, I'm sure there are people who early on were thinking about this, but you know, the fact that we went through an ICO craze, which is all about crowdfunding, and it went so wild that regulatory agencies got involved. And now we've got this DeFi space where at first it was like, okay, how do we do automated liquidity and things like that? And regulations getting involved there. And then it was like, okay, on top of liquidity, how do we build lending platforms and this sort? And so there's like this evolution of really smart people who see this tool set and go, oh, wow, I can solve this problem with that tool set that nobody had thought about before because the tool set didn't exist. And I think we had this age of from like 93 till probably 2000 of exploration of what can we do with this tool set called the internet. And there were just all kinds of things going on. And we got Google from that, and we got Yahoo from that. So we got lots of these companies that came from that discovery of a need for using this tool set. But I think it's clear from the early days, everybody kind of expected it to be that interconnectivity layer. But nobody was sure how to get it out to people and how to kind of onboard people, consumers. And that's where the AOLs and CompuServes and Earthlinks played a role. But then we very quickly found our way outside of that box.
Yeah, can I say something? So just to be clear, the World Wide Web is a part of the internet, right? So World Wide Web, or WWW, is like the HTTP protocol invented by Tim Berners-Lee in the early 90s. What I would say though is, and so like email is a completely separate protocol that also runs on the, you know, like I would consider the internet like what runs on TCP/IP, you know, I guess broadly speaking. And like blockchains are other new protocols that don't necessarily, that aren't the web. Now people might use the web for like as a user interface for dApps, but completely separate protocol, right? That's not running on HTTP. But something I would say though is that in the 90s, with the web providing basically a user interface for the internet, for example, many people access their email through the web, even though you know you could actually do email without the web. And in fact, email existed for many years before the web. The web is what really took off, so much so that many people just think of the internet as the web is the internet. Interesting, of course, with mobile phones, we've had the rise of apps, which are not the web. And so some people have said, oh, are we moving on from the web? You know, the web hasn't gone away. although it has, I think, decreased in relative importance at least a little bit since now we're using apps. But yeah, so I'd say that the web has been one of the main things that people have been doing with the internet.
Cool. And so one thing I picked up from each of you is this idea of interconnectivity, connectedness, global, right? These were all very inspirational things, especially in the 90s and probably through the early aughts as well. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about maybe that wasn't all rainbows and sunshine, right? So what were some of the unintended consequences, not all positive, for interconnectivity, being able to talk with anybody, anywhere, anytime? And then we'll move on to some more topics. But Ken, why don't you jump in there?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that come to mind. I mean, first of all, now other people have access to my computer. So, that was an unintended consequence of when we get into viruses and hacking and things like that. I think from a commercial side, there not only was there access to information outside of me, but very quickly I became a product on that flow of information. So my information became accessible on the internet as well. And now what we see is, and this is, we'll go into some further questions on this, but my information became a commodity on the internet, both my activity and my personal information and anything. It became accessible and easily portable, just like everything else on the internet was. And so that's where we find ourselves now, where we've got the privacy discussions going on of who owns that information. And I think it's pretty well wrapped up now, but a few years ago, this wasn't wrapped up. Who owns that information, and how can they use my information? And if you're not the consumer, then you're the product, was kind of the mantra of the last few years. And so I think those are kind of some of the things we see is there's access to our computers, and there might be nefarious access, or you can call them bad actors if we want to talk in DLT terms. And then we also have this idea of our identity and personal information, and all that stuff became easily accessible and portable very quickly.
Yeah, Brantly, what do you think about this interconnected thing and some of the unintended consequences?
Yeah, the way I think about it is that there was this smart guy in the late 20th century, Marshall McLuhan, who had a lot of commentary on media, and he had this famous phrase everyone talks about: the medium is the message. His point was that technology is not just like a conduit, it creates new social environments. And the way a new technology changes the social environment is often far more important than the information that is put through that medium, right? So like the fact that with the internet and social media and the web and blah, 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 the fact that everybody in the world can conceivably interact with everybody else in the world at the same time, that is more important than maybe the specific content, right? That people are like messaging with each other. Or like, the television was another thing that totally changed the way society is like formulated. So what I see is that the internet has created this new social technological environment, and power structures have changed and are changing constantly. And also the types of skills needed to navigate that are different than the previous social technical environment. And so because we've just created this, nobody has the skills. And so people are freaking out. They're making lots of mistakes. Or like, I don't know if you've seen this, I grew up on the internet. So there are mistakes I made on Facebook, let's say back in 10 years ago, 10, 12, 14 years ago, that like some people, like let's say older people, our parents' generation, who are just getting on Facebook are like making all the same mistakes because they're learning to operate in that environment. And so the way I view a lot of these discussions about like, oh, fake news or misinformation, and oh, I believed that fake news, or I'm getting really angry at people on the internet, or we need to cancel everybody, or we shouldn't cancel, or we should, or who can be on Twitter or not. it's that we're trying to figure out how do we operate in this new environment, and nobody really knows because we've never done it anymore. So I view this as growing pains that hopefully will eventually reach a stable point where as a culture, we've come up with, okay, this is how we kind of agree to operate in this new environment. That's what I think about it.
Galen, yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's basically correct. Like, I always think of this old Neil Stephenson quote about how like the two ends of a wire are the same place. So a wire is like a wormhole, sort of warp space. And as is kind of happening right now, like where are we? Everybody is in different physical places, but we're kind of together. So what is the place that people live in when they live online? And yeah, I mean, throughout many thousands of years of human history, like we're very much adapted to, you know, being around a finite number of people in a physical place with a relationship to that place and the weather and the tides and the sun and so on. And so how you, yeah, what are the rules of the digital world? We just completely don't know. And it's not like we, collectively, culturally, whatever, like made a decision of like, you know what, we need to build this thing and we're going to figure out the rules for it. It's happened very haphazardly, which is completely fine, but it's, unsurprisingly chaotic. And so I think that we all know that, yeah, the kind of connectedness is valuable and powerful and important. And it sort of enriches our experience because it gives us an idea of what's going on in a different place. But that place where we are able to connect with people who are all scattered about in different places with different ideas and different perspectives on the world, you know, that also, like the digital world itself, like needs some form of order or some form of rules. And we don't yet know what that is. And to be honest, I don't know. I think that's a very hard problem. Like, I think that's a problem that people will work on for a long time. Like, I think we're all probably working on it in different capacities. But it's an incredibly difficult problem. Like, it's a problem on the order of like how you decide to build cities or organize towns or whatever, which is something that, you know, over the long term took people many generations to figure out. It's not a simple thing.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd argue that organizing a nation or a global nation, it's towns would be much easier to organize than the internet based off of what we've been doing.
Yeah, the internet, I mean, the network is a state, right? Like we basically know that, like everyone sort of intuitively knows that, but it's a very difficult and uncomfortable thing to grapple with because of course the network also has no resources. It's not a traditional state. It's just an unusual idea on its own. And I think it's not actually very well worked out. It's like, we know that that's true, but how could that possibly be true? And how does that work? And who governs it? We don't really know.
Yes. And I would just add to, personally, I think the only way out is through. So I don't think that we can't go back. We can't go to a pre-internet world. I mean, unless, you know, there's EMP, nuclear holocaust, Carrington event, blah, blah, blah. You know, barring that, like the only way out is through. So we can't, I think what happens is, the old values don't work anymore. Not exactly. Yes, there's all these great things, but there's all these terrible things. And the easy thing is like, we have to just get rid of the internet. It'd be like, the printing press has caused all these social problems. We need to get rid of it. Well, I think now you can't get rid of it. You can't uninvent it. It's the new world. So I think the only way out is through. And I think it's painful. There'll be a lot of mistakes, but I think we'll eventually find some stable situation. I hope.
It's a great segue. All right, so if we're going to reimagine this thing, the internet, what are some of the things that maybe we want to keep? Or do we want to keep anything? Maybe Brantly says, well, we can't really uninvent it, so there's going to have to be something that comes along for the ride. What are the good things that need to make sure that they continue to go forward into the new reimagined internet? So, Galen, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So let's see. There's this great John Cleese TED Talk where he talks about losing a screenplay. And he had written this screenplay, maybe I'm going to poorly paraphrase this, but the way I remember it is he had written this whole screenplay and it's like the greatest thing he'd ever written, and then he lost it. And he rewrote the entire thing from memory because he remembered most of it. And after he rewrote the whole thing, years later, I think even, he found the original. And he read the original, and the new one was better. It was like basically the same structure, but the new one was like vastly better. And I love, it's a good talk. Sad that it's a TED talk because it's a good talk. But it's also like, it's a good talk because it's something we all kind of know to be true. Like if you want to do something really well, you have to do lots of versions, but one of the like kind of painful parts of doing multiple versions is like looking at the old one and deciding what you want to keep. Like it's better to just maybe not look at it and you just know, like you kind of unconsciously know what's important and what's not important, which is definitely generally like my approach to this kind of stuff. Like I want to think about basically like almost like just the user experience. Like the main thing is to focus on how does this impact people's lives and how do they use it? And how does it, cause them to organize their communities and so on, like focus on the felt experience and how it shapes the world. Don't think about the technology, because you can build the technology to suit the outcome that you're trying to engineer, the sort of vision for the future that you're trying to generate. And so make sure that vision is clear. Don't think too much about the specifics. I will say though, I think that the one thing that we've learned through the like rise and distribution of the internet is that accessibility is amazing. So the fact that basically anybody can, pull something out of their pocket and get access to almost anything is actually fantastic and really, really cool. And part of that is not just the fact that you have a cell connection or a piece of hardware or whatever. It's also just the raw interface of the whole, like it's the whole stack together being something that's relatively easy for almost anyone to understand. That is, I think, definitely a good thing. I think it's also something you can't get rid of. So I think that people often get wrapped up in like specific technical things that we're going to improve, which I think is important to consider. But it's like at the end of the day, the most important thing that you're going to preserve, I guess it's like if I had to pick one thing, is basically the fact that you are, unlike the mid 90s or the 70s, this is fine. This is something I've always thought about. I don't have a concise way of articulating this, but at the beginning of the internet, it was definitely like, it's a military project. It's a bunch of nerds. It's a small community of people. It grows slowly. So the addressable audience is small. Now we have a huge addressable audience, which is actually a great thing. And we want to keep that thing. But if you're thinking about what's next, you're not necessarily just going to start with a tiny audience that's maybe slowly going to get bigger over 20, 30 years. You're going to start with a small audience that may get very rapidly larger over the course of like a year or 2 years. And that's actually a good thing. So you're building at like a much bigger scale, like a much larger scale just globally. And I guess that's, yeah, I don't know. That's the thing I would keep. Am I ignoring the second part of the question? That's
fine. You can ignore it.
What do we want to do differently? Everything else we want to do differently. I'd follow otherwise take the John Cleese approach. Just forget it and just focus on, what you're trying to give to people. Anyway, I'll
That's such an urban answer. I'm just kidding.
It's true. It's true, but I'm willing to defend it.
No,
irrelevant. Go for it.
Yeah, Ken, what do you think on this topic?
It's, I don't think we have much choice what we're going to get to keep. I think that the things that we've been seeing, the trajectories, clear for right now, but there's lots of things like the flow of the free flow of information. In the early days, it probably flowed a little bit more freely, but there also was some really bad stuff happening too. And now there are some controls in place, but I'd like to see that information continue to flow freely, at least useful information. I can't tell you how many lifetimes worth of skills I've accumulated through YouTube and the sort. Multiple lifetimes worth of skills I've accumulated because of YouTube that would have otherwise been inaccessible. And I think that free flow of useful information is what we really need to preserve. As far as how things are going to change, I can talk a little bit about the hashgraph algorithm and Leemon in this context, because I remember when we started the company, we had like a company get together early on, and basically they rented, I think it was like on Airbnb, a mansion, and had the whole team fly in. We all stayed in the same house for like a week. And it was awesome to have these conversations with Leemon and Mance, you know, sitting over breakfast or whatever. And I remember talking to Leemon about it, and kind of to Galen's point, he wasn't thinking, how do I do blockchain better? He was thinking, how do I do distributed compute, period. So he didn't start from a point. He just kind of like ignored that anybody else had kind of already solved the problem, and kind of went, okay, how do I solve this problem more efficiently? And he came up with the hashgraph algorithm, which, you know, objectively, it's and I'm going to throw some superlatives out there. So, but if you look at the algorithm objectively, it's the fairest model of coming to consensus that exists. Now, the question of productizing, that's a different discussion altogether, but the algorithm itself was solid, and he and I were talking about it, and I remember his vision, and he said this on a few interviews, so I don't mind sharing it. But I remember it touched me when he said, you know, the company that he started to own that algorithm was called Swirlds. And everybody goes, what is Swirlds? Well, it's shared worlds. And the idea is that the compute is shared between parties wherever they may be. So you and I could set up a connection with a few other people. So say we have 5 people, and the 5 of us maintain the state of our interaction. And we basically carve out a little space of the internet for ourselves. And we use the hashgraph algorithm to ensure that there's no bad actors in our group and that it's fairly coordinated. And the idea that you could do that with any subset of groups. If you wanted to play Minecraft with 40 people, you just set up your own little swirl, which was all founded on the hashgraph algorithm, and everybody came to consensus about the state of the game at any given time. So you had this amazing vision of multiple swirls and layers of swirls on top of each other, where the internet's not going to be a big wide web. It's going to be like a 4-dimensional web at that point, where you've got layers upon layers and interconnected layers, and you know, entire universes and multiverses of connectivity. And you control your information, so you control who you create these swirls with, and you authorize what you want to share. And so there's all these ideas that he had, and the algorithm itself is brilliant. If you get a chance, take a look at it. But that was the foundation of Hedera hashgraph. Hedera itself is the public implementation of that. So there's like a mainnet, and that's the public massive network. But the algorithm that underlies it, you know, really the long-term vision is, how do we create this world where there are multiple layers of these kind of private networks that operate over the large-scale TCP/IP network as a whole. And I'm sure the Urbit guys can agree with the vision on that. And it's 2 different ways of solving it. This is a very low-level protocol way to do it, and you guys have your own low-level protocol way to do it as well. But that was the vision, right? And so that's being that both, you know, Leemon and the hashgraph algorithm, and even Urbit, who's here, you guys are thinking in that way. It shows kind of like this trajectory of where we're going, where the internet's not a monolith of connected points. It's lots of interconnected and maybe not so interconnected networks that all interoperate with each other, and things start to push to the edge. So if we start thinking about how we change the next generation of internet, I would say that everybody can belong to multiple internets, and they get to decide which ones they belong to. And a lot of the compute, or all of the compute if we can, gets pushed to the edge. In other words, closer to the consumers and the users, the people who produce and use the data. A lot of that information and compute gets pushed to the edge. And so that's where I see the internet going next, is it's more of networks upon networks upon networks, and your privacy, your information and your privacy is yours. It's all sovereign.
All right, Brantly, what do you think here?
Yeah, what should we keep? It's good. I mean, you know, I don't think email is going anywhere. The email protocol seems pretty solid. You know, TCP/IP is probably around. I mean, it's like we want to reinvent the internet. I mean, you could like reinvent the whole stack, and the stack's a lot bigger than people think. I mean, it's like so many protocols down. There's like an Ethernet protocol, like the wire has its protocol. I mean, there's a lot of protocols, and to get to where we've gotten, it's like 20 protocols deep or something. I mean, to do basic things. So often when people talk about reinvent the internet, they mean like just the high level protocols. So like, in the block, coming from the blockchain space, it's like, we need to get away from everybody using systems that are basically cloud computing, where like a certain company controls basically the whole thing, which is great for efficiency and low cost, but is bad for privacy and control and things like this. So some sort of blockchain thing can maybe help with that, which I generally support.
Okay, I think Galen, you said something that I want to riff off of here for our next question, which was something like nobody or some of the things that people wanted to do in the early internet, they just couldn't because it just wasn't ready, right? And here we are trying to reimagine the internet again. We have a certain set of tools, but it begs the question, do we have the right tools? If not, what could those tools be? This is somewhat of a technical question, so I think we've got a fairly technical audience. So if you want to go into technicals here, please do. But the general question is, do we have what we need in terms of a tool set to reimagine the internet? And Brantly, why don't you start us off here?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that holds us back is most people who use the internet. And what I mean, but that's not like a criticism, but what I mean is that even today, there's like a lot of things that are possible, a lot of things. And what can happen is you get your like small group of like geeks or something like this, you get really excited about something and they start using it because they understand it and are motivated enough to do it. But unless we just want it to be the little niche project for, for geeks, we've got to connect with the average person. The average person doesn't understand the things as well and is less motivated. So like just simply lack of, like if everyone was motivated, a lot of things could happen. It's like Urbit maximalism, right? We're all on Urbit tomorrow because just everyone's like motivated, right? Like a lot of it is just, it's the coordination of people. So I would say, a lot of the tools exist. Yeah, new technology needs to be created, but I mean, so much of it just comes down to motivation.
Ken, what do you think here?
Yeah, I mean, I agree to a degree with Brantly. I think, there's a reason Facebook still exists versus other protocols that might have been more secure and privacy friendly. But clearly people appreciate the network effects of things. And sometimes the convenience or access to the network effect is more valuable than privacy and security. So I think there's a huge social hurdle to overcome. But I think we have a lot of the technology, and I think a lot of it is due to the blockchain space. We have a lot of this like reinvigoration of the cryptography space in general, the sciences around cryptography, and distributed compute and distributed storage and all these things that kind of are realizing the visions that, in the telecom space, we've been talking about this for 10 years. How do we push things to the edge? And the challenge is always, it's fine if we push things to the edge, but then how do you coordinate? And how do you keep people safe and secure without having these gateways that check for those things? How is the world going to survive without ISPs was kind of the question. And ISPs play such a critical role in all of this. But I think a lot of the tools, and I really think of the blockchain movement as kind of the evolution of the tool set necessary for the next stage, because it really shifted the discussion and focus. So on the other side of what Brantly is saying, I think a lot of the disciplines that are required to move to the next stage are incentivized by, as much as I hate to say it, the monetary gain that came with the cryptocurrency space and distributed technology. Because of that, we wanted more privacy. We wanted better cryptography, more efficient cryptography, and networks on top of networks. And so I think the demand is coming thanks to this space. And it's kind of like NASA. You think of NASA, like, why do we spend so much money to put a rover on Mars? And the reality is, like, humankind as a whole is benefiting immensely more from the technology that comes out of these engineering efforts than just putting a rover on Mars. Even though that's amazing, all the technology that comes out of that is benefiting humankind. We're learning stuff about how to create small nuclear devices and how to gather soil in strange environments and how to deal with different G-forces. And we're learning all this stuff that's going to be valuable to humankind on a grander scale. So I think the investment in NASA is well worthwhile because the whole human race benefits from the technological advancements of these missions. And the same thing I feel like with blockchain. We've got this tool set that's starting to come up. And a lot of it's being developed because of the monetary drive. So as much as I'm not a huge fan of like the speculative space and kind of the Wild West nature, and by the way, I'm happy to benefit from it when I can. But you know, to me, that's not the strongest motivator, but it was enough to get people excited. And kind of to Brantly's point, you got to get something that brings people to ask for that technology. And I think that's what we've seen over the last few years between the ICO movement and the cryptocurrency movement right now. So we're building all the tools. I think we're on a great trajectory right now.
All right, Galen?
Yeah, I think we agree. We might disagree about some of the details, doesn't matter. But yeah, I think I might find I think the toolkit we have that's being built in this space broadly is very promising, but I think it's very, very immature. But the outlines strike me as correct, and I think we'll figure it out, basically. So it feels a little bit like maybe 1988 or something along those lines. You know, I think it's actually a relatively long road ahead. I think that what is promising about this toolkit, sort of broadly, I guess, is basically that this is maybe kind of like following on, or is like a better answer to the last question in some ways. But basically, like, I think that people actually want technology to be mostly invisible. Like, they want it to actually kind of disappear and go into the background and just be obvious and more infrastructure-like. And most of the technology for connecting with other people digitally that we have is kind of noisy as a side effect of its architecture. So like Facebook has to want to keep you around, because if they can't keep you around looking at ads, then they can't pay for the servers. So that's just like a side effect of how it's built. And you can see that throughout a lot of different things. So I think of like, why doesn't my car know who I am when I walk up to it? I mean, okay, it kind of does when I have a key, but I also feel like my key and my phone and my wallet or whatever. And like, this isn't a startup idea. Obviously, it's like, it would be a terrible startup, but you can see it as almost like an infrastructure-like idea. Like, it's like all of our connected devices, they actually aren't really connected. They have to connect to some server somewhere. And so there's all kinds of like, there's this whole territory of stuff that could be improved. And if you look at, can a blockchain solve that problem? Well, like, not kind of, but like there's a bunch of other components that are needed there in terms of networking and authentication and so on. And we have the parts, we do actually have the parts to make that kind of like your everyday experience of using technology be something that's like very seamlessly integrated, that's very complete. But we have the parts in the form of, I think, mostly sort of sketches. And I mean, I think you're also right that we also have basically the incentive. We have the kind of the economic model actually to take those sketches and realize them. So that's also promising. But I think it's early.
And so one thing you actually said earlier, Galen, was like the internet is kind of like a state. I mean, it's this weird kind of concept, but it kind of is. And countries, states, they have norms, they have values. What are the norms and the values that the reimagined internet should have? Brantly, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think there are people who are the very online, to use a term, and then there are people who are like the kind of online, and then of course there actually are still people in the world who are not online, although that's increasingly, I think, heading towards going away. And I mean, there's more groups than this, but I think these three groups of people, they view it differently, and they do have different values. I mean, there are people, who they work and live in their local community, and yeah, the internet, it's just something that they like kind of do sometimes, and made for entertainment. And then there's people who live online, their friends, their career, all that. And that certainly does create, I think, for those people, more of a cosmopolitan or kind of global view. And I say these words, value neutral, not saying they're good or bad, as opposed to people who are more focused on their local community, have a more of a local view. And I think we have a culture clash there. So anyway, so what should be the new things of the global world? So yeah, the internet is like global values, right? It's like, oh, the whole world should be on one system. We should have the same rules everywhere. It should all be flat, to use Thomas Friedman's thing. Whereas local people are like, I don't know, we don't want the same rules everywhere. Hey, stop other people in other parts of the world messing up what we have here. It's just this culture clash.
Ken, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think we're trying to figure that out too, because I know younger people who grew up with chat rooms and YouTube and TikTok and Musical.ly and Vine and all of these, it's clear they have a different set of values than those who maybe were introduced to the internet or maybe later in life than all their life. So I do think that there's a clash. I think what we're going to see is people realizing what their sphere of influence is and being interested in what those spheres of influence are. So for example, Brantly brought up the local versus the global context. In the local context, if my neighbor's fence blows down in a windstorm, I can go over and help them set it back up. I actually have something I can do. If I see something on the internet happening on the other side of the world that disturbs me, there's really nothing I can do. My sphere of influence is very limited in that context, and I think we're seeing a lot of maybe social awareness and maybe a lot of awareness of the needs of the world on a global scale. I think kind of to go back to an earlier question, we saw this explosion of information, and information flows freely. I don't think the world's any worse than it's ever been. As a matter of fact, it's probably a little bit better than it's ever been, a lot better. But we see a lot more bad things than we've ever seen. And I think what we need to come to terms with is, how do we grow our sphere of influence to help better certain things that we're seeing, and how do we figure out how do we deal with some of the stressors that come from seeing a lot of that bad stuff. There's a lot of maybe unnecessary fear that's been generated. Kidnappings are down in the US compared to historically, but if you were to look at the internet, you wouldn't let your kid outside onto your front lawn without parental supervision. So, and a big dog. But it's things like that that we're going to have to come to terms with, and I think the value systems are just going to have to filter down to more fundamental value systems. I think right now we're realizing there's a value system clash, and we're also realizing the impact that it has on our children. But we're going to have to come to terms with that, and we're going to have to filter it down to what are these common value systems. And I think there are some fundamental and global value systems, like do no harm's always a good value to hold, that can generally be globally accepted in very rare circumstances otherwise. But there are certain values I think that we're going to realize are kind of to go back to to Socrates, that truth is universal, but truth can only be self-discovered. So I think we're going through that process of discovering what these global truths are, these universal truths are, and the information age is perfect for that. But kind of what Brantly was talking about before, we're gonna have to go through it first, and we're still in that. and to Galen's point, we're still early in all of this too.
Hey, Galen?
Yeah, it's a tough question, but it's a good question, and it's one we should have the answer to by now, or maybe better answers to. I think that, let's see. I think that one of the, let's see. I'm like, this is a tough question because it can really like, one could ramble pretty indefinitely. So one of the things that's really amazing about the internet, I think, is that it has the potential to be a system in which we can all agree to believe in the infrastructure and also to kind of like leave each other alone, right? And I feel like there's a kind of there's something, I don't know if it's sort of American or at this point really Western in that structure, right? Like in this country and in many Western countries, the idea is sort of like, we want the system to work, we want our infrastructure to work, but we acknowledge that communities are very, very different from one another, and they may not even like each other, but they're going to coexist. And actually that coexistence is something that we all also believe in. And I feel like one of the kind of embedded, like the internet is very much like that, right? We all share a network. We don't necessarily all have to interact. We can exist in relatively separate spaces, but we all speak TCP/IP or whatever. But I think that taking those values and making them actually global, outside of the West, outside of countries where those kinds of values are embedded in the culture somehow, is a huge and kind of uncomfortable challenge. But it's something that I think people should have to reconcile with ultimately. Like, and I think that people like ourselves who work on this stuff have to think deeply about, basically, because you're both giving individual communities tools for structuring themselves, but also the potential to set the rules of engagement of how they interact with other people. And so I think that in terms of like, the internet as a state, like this is an area that people should generally sort of like think more deeply about, I guess. And also figure out a way of making that something that people can get basically like almost like get excited about. Like I think that right now, like in the sort of default public, globally legible internet, it's just a completely ungoverned space, but you have the potential for it to be something that's actually relatively well structured, where people can, feel good about sort of participating in this. We all use the same infrastructure, but we kind of like leave each other alone and like respect the fact that people are different than us, and so on and so forth. Somehow those values, like I think the internet sort of has no value system, but there's great potential for it to actually like develop one to some degree. But it's a bigger challenge to do that on a global scale than to do it on like territorially limited or like geographically limited scale.
Right. Can I just make a point there? Because I'm going to contradict you a little bit, Galen, there. So I've had the great fortune of traveling to many big cities. And it's funny because, I lived in Seoul, in Seoul, Korea in 2000 to 2002. And when I lived there, it was a very unique culture. You could say things were very Korean. The value systems were very Korean, and commerce, they had their own culture, and I had to learn that culture and respect that culture. And kind of to your point, we could all live on the same ground, but we had to, we can go our separate ways and live our own value systems. But then we came together and kind of, because I was on Korean soil, I respected the Korean culture. And I did the same thing with Germany and Ireland and a few other countries where I got to live in a few different places earlier in my life and see kind of the differences in value systems. And then I've gone back over the last 10 years and everything's kind of homogenizing. Like I can go to San Francisco and have a very similar experience to going to Paris or to Berlin or to Seoul even, right, or Dublin, but everything's kind of homogenizing. And I think of like, when people are like, oh, what's it like to go to Paris? I'm like, it's like going to San Francisco, except for better architecture. And so, and maybe better food. I don't know. Yeah, maybe better food. But things are starting to homogenize even globally, and I think a lot of that is due to both the mobility of people, the demands of the people traveling around the world are starting to homogenize what the supply is providing, but also the access to information, which is the internet. So I think what I'm seeing is more of a homogenization of cultures across the internet. Now, the specific rules of their value systems might be different depending on where you live, because there's also religious contexts in there and other political, geopolitical contexts in there. But I'm seeing a lot of homogenization already in how the world operates, both on the internet and off the internet. I don't know that there's a specific effort to homogenize the value system at all, and I don't know that there needs to be.
Yeah. So maybe I'm not being clear enough, obviously. So the important thing to me is that like you actually want communities to be able to be more different than they are today, like different in the extreme, and still share infrastructure and think that sharing infrastructure is a good thing. And so I think in a world of like the default public internet that's lived in a way for too long, where everyone lives in public all the time, you can see its effects in the real world, where everyone sort of reads the same news. How many news sources are there? I don't know, 5. And everyone lives on the same social networks. And so you don't just have it, you actually want more differentiation at the level of the individual community, but you want individual communities to be able to be comfortable with the fact that they share the same network protocols, and like that's okay, and it's good to have those protocols actually work. And so I think of that as being very much like that's the federalist model, like that's the Roman Republican model. Like this is an ancient form, like human form. We've had this around in different cultures for a long time. And in a way, like the networked world is trying to make that a similar model work globally, but it's very closeted or like cagey about just saying that outright and saying, look, we want you to be able to do your thing and be however you're going to be, but in order for that to work, you've got to somehow contribute to the common infrastructure. And I'm not saying I have that exactly worked out, but I feel like for the network to work, like that's kind of like that's the value system, the root value system, where sure, individual cultures could be very differentiated, but they have to share some like bare minimum set of protocols to interoperate, something to that.
Man, if we only had a way to have shared worlds somehow.
Yeah, real quick on the homogenization. Yeah, that's true. I mean, so there's a term for that. It's cosmopolitanism, right? So where in the major cities you mentioned, it's increasingly it's like, let's say San Francisco in some ways could be more similar. Somebody in San Francisco could be more similar to somebody in Paris than somebody in a rural place in the United States, even though you're within countries, right? And so, so certain place, right? So it's like if the connected people are kind of forming a culture, the less connected people, the unconnected people have their own. So it's more about who you're connected to, which is increasingly, at least for some people, not necessarily geographic.
Yep.
All right, so we are running a little over time. But I want to make sure all of the panelists can once again say who you are, what you're working on, and where people can find more about you as we close up. So Ken, let's start with you, Brantly, and then kind of up Galen.
Yeah, so I'm Ken Anderson with Hedera Hashgraph, and I brought up this concept of shared worlds, and that's really the vision and the start of Hedera Hashgraph. And what we're doing right now is really creating, I would even say, the fairest and the gold standard of security for public networks. And that's what we're building. It's a technological play. It's not an economic play. And it's something that was born out of a vision for exactly what we're talking about, which is this kind of layered interconnectivity, networks of networks. And that's what we're trying to do. And when we think about, even if we look at our mission statement, it's about doing good. It's a very altruistic mission statement, but it's about how do we empower people to own their own connectivity and own their own interactions and own their information, and do this all in a secure and fair way. And so that's what we're doing. The public network is kind of the first phase of all of this, and I think it's a critical core part of it, and it'll continue to improve. But as we evolve, I expect that we'll see Hashgraph as an algorithm or Hedera as an organization becoming integral to some of the more global efforts that we're seeing right now.
Man, Brantly?
Yeah, I'm involved in a project called the Ethereum, Ethereum name service. That is a naming protocol that runs on the Ethereum blockchain. It does not mean it's like for the Ethereum community, although it certainly is, or it doesn't mean it's only for the Ethereum community. It certainly serves that community, but it's just a general purpose naming system that can ultimately name anything. The kind of the bread and butter use cases for it right now are crypto payments. Rather than having, send someone your Bitcoin address or Ethereum address, Dogecoin address, they're all these user-friendly things. You just send them, hey, send to Brantly.xyz, and they can send any crypto to it. This is widely adopted. We're in 176 different applications, including like 45 wallets, tons of dApps, even some browsers like Brave and Opera and others. The MetaMask plugin, which a lot of people in the blockchain space have. The second bread and butter use case is decentralized websites. So like I mentioned, we have this in Opera, Brave natively, and MetaMask. We have a gateway service operated by Cloudflare, so this is exploding. And really, we see this not as trying to directly compete with DNS. We're actually integrating the DNS namespace. We want to be compatible with DNS and complement and extend the capabilities of DNS. Maybe in a long-term future scenario, ENS could become more core to the internet's naming system. But right now, we just want to extend DNS because DNS is really good at what it does. So if you want to learn more, ens.domains is our website, ens.domains.
Me again. I work on Urbit, and yeah, there's still no simple way to explain what Urbit is. Someone the other day told me that Urbit falls into this category of thing that you actually just have to use to understand, which I think is correct. But you can think of, I guess I work on this project primarily because I think that our everyday user experience of how we communicate, collaborate, go about our sort of daily networked computing lives can be much, much better. And so we use Urbit from day to day to talk to each other at the company and within the Urbit community, and people use Urbit to sort of form their own communities. And so I guess, I encourage you really just to go check out what Urbit is and where it's going. You can, if you're interested in the technology itself, you can go to urbit.org and install it yourself, check out the source and learn about the system. If you're curious to just use it as a casual user, we, the company who works primarily on this, offer hosting and a sort of more user-friendly experience at Tlon, tlon.io. But yeah, I guess like the main thing that I hope that Urbit can be useful for is really for people to be able to build communities in a way that they feel like sort of reflects what the community is and how it should work, and take ownership over how they communicate and come together in a networked world. As soon as humanly possible, as this thing that we know and love seems to be sort of showing its age. Yeah.
All right, and with that, thank you all to the panelists, and there will be a little short time in the lobbies here, so please do join us over there, and thank you and good night.